The Winter War by Priscilla Shirer with Gina Detweiler. Chapter 15, The Comeback. Xavier was having a hard time concentrating on schoolwork. All he could think about was the basketball game that night. The Cedar Creek Lions were playing the Riverview Sharks, and Xavier was suiting up as one of the only two sophomores on the varsity team. He couldn't wait to get back on the court, especially after that disaster in Horritos. He needed a win. Coach Kavanaugh had been impressed with his playing and promised he would put Xavier in the game. He just wished Mr. J.R. would be there to give him some pointers and cheer him on. His strong, steady presence encouraged Xavier, made him want to play harder and better than he had ever before. But Mr. J.R. wasn't even home from the hospital. The news wasn't very good. He didn't just have his appendix out. He was still pretty sick. It would be weeks until he would be able to come to a game. Xavier opened his locker and quickly took out the books he needed for his geometry class. He glanced at his phone. 10 text notifications, and more kept coming in, most of them about the game. He swiped the screen and started to read them as he slammed his locker door shut and headed to class. But he wasn't looking where he was going and rammed into someone walking past him. His phone went flying, along with the other person's books. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at the student he had run into. She was bending down to pick up her books. "No problem," she said. She grabbed his phone and handed it back to him. "My fault." She smiled. She had long brown hair and pretty brown eyes. "No, I wasn't looking." Xavier just stared at her. "It's okay," she said. "I hope your phone's not broken." It's fine." Xavier stuck it in his pocket without looking at it. "You're Xavier, right? You play basketball?" "Yeah." "Cool. I'm Cassie." "Oh." Cassie waited for him to say something more, and when he didn't, she shrugged. "Good luck at the game." "Thanks." She smiled again and turned to walk down the hall. Xavier watched her go. The gymnasium was filled to capacity. Fans for both the Sharks and the Lions were already cheering as their teams filed in from the locker rooms and sat on their respective benches on either side of the scoring table. The Sharks mascot ran across the court, waving his fins and pretending to scare the onlookers. The Lions mascot roared crazily and chased the shark around. On the bench, Xavier had to keep his hand on his leg to stop it from shaking. He looked up at the bleachers, searching for his family and friends. He saw his parents sitting 3 rows up from the floor, along with Evan, who waved at him. Xavier smiled but didn't wave. He hoped he'd get a little playing time so his family wouldn't have come to the game for nothing. Brianna was there with her grandfather, holding up a sign that said, "Go Xavier." They both waved. Xavier didn't see Levi anywhere, though he wasn't surprised. They hadn't spoken since Levi's blow-up in the Garden of Red. He wasn't mad at Levi, but he did think Levi was still mad at him. At the very top of the bleachers, Xavier saw Cassie, the girl he had run into in the hall, sitting with a bunch of other girls. She caught his eye and waved. He smiled and turned around quickly. "Ooh, Cassie Kavanaugh. I think she likes you." Darren, the other sophomore, gave him a shoulder shove. "Nice work, Romeo." "Nah," said Xavier, shaking his head. He looked away so Darren couldn't see his face redden. "Wait, did you say Kavanaugh?" "Yeah, Coach's daughter." Xavier felt the heat creep up the back of his neck. Coach's daughter. Why didn't I know that? Just then, Coach Cav walked into the gym and gathered his team around him for a huddle. "Listen up, boys. Remember what we talked about in the locker room. I know you're nervous. We missed a week of practice with a snowstorm. Turn those nerves into energy. Have fun out there. This team likes to drive to the basket, so be on guard. Keep it steady and work together. Be respectful. Be a good sport. Got it?" The boys nodded and agreed. The coach put up his hands for high fives all around. "Hey, Coach," Xavier said. once the huddle broke. Are you going to put me in? Yeah, in a bit. Just be patient, Blake. Xavier sat down on the bench with the other guys as the starters took the court and got into position. The ref tossed the ball into the air. It was tipped off by the Lions point guard Eric, and the game was on. Xavier spent the whole first half of the game on the bench, cheering on his team. Every time Coach signaled for substitutes, Xavier sat up, hoping it would be his turn. It never was, but it was Lions 24-16 at the half. The team went into the locker room for halftime, while the cheerleaders and the mascots entertained the crowd. Doing great out there, Coach Cav said, but we need to keep up the pressure. Some of you boys are getting tired, so I'm going to mix up the subs. In the second half, he turned and looked right at Xavier. Blake, you're on point. Xavier nodded, but his insides started to churn. He was going to play point guard in his first varsity game. As the team headed back out to the court, Coach grabbed Xavier's shoulders. You think you can handle this, Blake? Yes, sir, I can. That's what I like to hear. Xavier's heart hammered, the blood pulsing in the center of his throat. He dared not look up at the stands. When the half second was about to begin, Xavier took to the court with the other players and readied for the tip-off. The light seemed very bright. The sound of the crowd magnified in his ears. Xavier kept his eyes on his teammates. He knew their strengths. Bryce was their best long shooter. Jonathan, the tallest, could get under the basket and lay up without even leaving the floor. Darren and Scott were quick, precise dribblers. Xavier had confidence in them and in himself. He was so excited he could barely wait for the tip-off. The ref tossed the ball into the air. Jonathan jumped for it, tipping it to Xavier, who spun around and passed to Darren. Xavier called to Darren and Scott, telling them where he wanted them to go. He focused on his strategy rather than the cheering crowd and the piercing stare of the coach. Darren took the ball down court and under pressure passed it to Scott, who dribbled around two defenders and passed to Jonathan. Jonathan did a layup and sank the ball in the basket for 2 points. The crowd cheered. They made 2 more baskets, and Xavier started to relax. He took the ball on a rebound and dribbled down court, faked a pass, and then ran around to the outside. He spun and passed to Bryce, who hit the rim. Jonathan recovered the basket, and cheers exploded again. The Sharks got control and sank a basket. The score, 30-18. Still a comfortable lead, but Xavier didn't want to take any chances. Sweat poured down his face in rivers. His hair was plastered to his head, but he was in the zone. This is what he needed to get beyond the disastrous battle in Horritos. He got the ball and dribbled down court, focused on which teammate he would pass to. He saw that Darren was open and bounced past the ball, then spun around and ran smack into one of the Sharks. He fell, his knee slamming into the floor. Pain shot through his leg. The ref blew the whistle to stop the play. Coach ran out to the court, but Xavier was already on his feet, testing his knee. It's cool, he said to his coach. I can play. Coach shook his head. Why don't you sit out for a bit? Make sure you're okay. Great job, Blake. The coach walked him to the bleachers. Xavier tried not to limp. It's fine, doesn't even hurt. He stole a glance at the crowd in the bleachers cheering for him. Evan was screaming his name and fist-pumping the air. Mom had a worried look on her face. Cassie, up near the top, was standing and watching intently. She smiled at him. Nice footwork, said Eric, giving Xavier a high five on his way out to play. Thanks, said Xavier. He sat down on the bench, fighting the urge to rub his knee. The game resumed. The Lions continued to gain ground, widening the lead to 15 points. Xavier jumped up and went over to the coach. Hey, Coach, can I play some more? He asked. He did a few jumps to prove his knee was fine. I'm good. Coach looked him over and sighed. If we get to 20 points up, I'll put you in. Xavier sat back down but continued to cheer as the Lions gained an 18-point lead. He felt his heart skip when the scoreboard read 54-34. Okay, Blake, check in, Coach said. Xavier jumped to his feet and went to the scorer's table to check in. He bent and unbent his knee a few times. It still hurt a little, but it worked fine. The buzzer sounded and Xavier ran onto the court. Wild cheers erupted. His heart soared. Xavier played harder than he ever had, running, dribbling, passing, shooting. His knee hurt, but he had played through pain before. It was no big deal. His team made 2 more baskets in a row. Xavier knew they were going to win, but he continued to pour it on. He got the ball on a rebound and dribbled down the court. He saw Jonathan open but ignored him, preferring to do a snake run around 2 of the Sharks and go in for a layup himself. This last basket would be all his. He jumped for the basket and felt something pop, a jarring shock radiating through his entire leg. By the time he landed, his leg wouldn't hold him, and he collapsed on the floor. The buzzer sounded just as the ball swished through the net. A new, more intense pain exploded in Xavier's leg. He grabbed hold of his knee, aware that something terrible bad had happened. But this was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Blake, are you all right? He looked up to see Coach Cav and a ref gazing down at him. His teammates crowded around, concern on their faces. Yeah, I'm fine. Just felt something go pop in my knee. He winced with pain and tried to get up, but every movement of that knee brought instant agony. The coach and Darren helped him up. Xavier hopped on one leg, leaning on them until he got to the bench. Jonathan's dad, who happened to be a doctor, knelt in front of Xavier and felt around his knee. I don't think it's broken, he said, but you'll need an MRI. I suspect it's a torn ACL. Xavier groaned. A torn ACL was a season-ending injury. The doctor put an ice pack on Xavier's knee and wrapped it in a gauze bandage. Xavier's mom and dad came down from the bleachers, their faces painted with worry. Someone ran in with a wheelchair. Xavier wanted to refuse. I can walk, just give me a minute. But in the end, he got into the wheelchair. His mom wheeled him out of the gym while his dad went to the locker room for his clothes. Xavier sat in the back of the car, the throbbing in his knee made worse by the realization that he was out for the season. No more basketball. Evan got into the seat beside him. Xavier turned away from him, looking out the window to avoid his gaze. Evan was wise enough not to try to talk to him. Once home, his parents helped him get to his room and into his bed. His mom gave him a fresh ice pack and some Tylenol for the pain. I've already made an appointment, she said. Thankfully, the office is open late tonight. We'll get in for the MRI first thing in the morning. Mom, what will they have to do if it's my ACL? Well, you might have to have surgery and rehab, she said with a sigh. Could be a few months. Xavier said nothing. His mom left the room, turning out the light. Xavier lay on his bed a long time, unable to sleep, thinking about what had happened. He glanced over at his closet door, which was open, and saw the stick Ruach had given him. So that's what it's for, he said to himself, the bitterness rising in his throat. A crutch.